Um, what a wonderful and thorough talk. I mean, every single time Deepaliji would start speaking about something, I would think that, okay, what about this? What about people who have already committed to engineering? What about people who have already started their PhD? But every single time, Deepaliji had an answer. And I really appreciate this level of thoroughness. So thank you for that. Moving on. Is my talk. So I'm going to be speaking about narratives, and specifically the war of narratives. So this is a word that we have heard thrown around in common parlance in the media a lot, but I feel that it requires and it demands some level of analysis and some level of understanding so that we are able to appreciate and understand the grave importance of this concept in today's day and age. So, to that end, my talk is going to be about what narratives are, it's going to be about why they matter, and it's going to be about how, as a Hindu community, we can construct effective narratives that can cause actual societal, large-scale societal change, meaningful societal change. So what are narratives? Let's see what the dictionary says. Narratives are a spoken or written account of connected events. They're a story. They are the narrated part of a literary work, as distinct from dialogue. They're the practice or art of telling a story. And this is the definition that I feel is the most important in this list. It's also the most convoluted one, so we'll break it down. Narratives are a representation of a particular situation or process in such a way as to reflect or conform to an overarching set of aims or values. This definition has two parts. Narratives are a representation. They're not the fact itself. They're not the truth itself. They're not the story itself. They're about how you are telling that story. They're about how you're representing it. And this representation, this storytelling, is done within a framework of governing aims and values. So through narratives, you take a truth and you try to tell somebody something about it. Narratives are about convincing people. As a consequence, effective narratives draw from an appeal to emotion rather than logic, because when you want to convince someone, emotion is far more effective. And we'll see examples of this in the coming slides. Another important element that you can deduce from these definitions are that narratives do not require their message to actually align with truth. They do not even need to relate to true stories, and we've seen this in our daily lives so many times. We've seen how a given fact has been twisted to, for example, show Hindus in a bad light. So narratives do not need to be truthful. They do not need to relate to true stories or be truthful in their representation. Okay, so now we have a primer on what narratives are. What is the definition? Why do these matter? Why is narratology actually a subject in so many colleges? What is the fuss about this? What is all the fuss about this? Why should we care about them? Here is why. Narratives affect the masses. If you have some event that has been reported all across the globe, and those reportings, the way that that story about that actual fact, that actual event has been told, it conforms to a certain aim, it conforms to certain values, it conforms to a certain message, then that is what changes people's mind, it is what changes people's perceptions, and when we're talking about communities, it is what determines how these communities will be treated by the rest of the world. Perception, therefore, is massively important in all societies. And it is especially important in societies which are governed by themselves. They're especially important in democracies. And let's look at some examples of narratives in action. How narratives have been able to affect massive change. And I will going forward, I will actually allude to a couple of examples that Deepali ji gave. So let's look at this first narrative, that Hinduism is casteism and patriarchy. This is an idea that we are all familiar with. We have all heard in the media. We have all heard in various academic textbooks, in college lectures, in school lectures. How is this narrative propagated? What does this narrative lead to? Well, for one, it is perpetrated, it is propagated through visuals, through visual devices like posters, stop caste rape, smash Brahmanical patriarchy. It is done through demonstrations. Here we have a Muslim woman, not a Hindu, who is saying that Dalit lives matter. She has no stake. She has nothing to do with this. But this is a narrative that has been constructed. So through narratives, you not only engage people from your own community, because you're talking about massive perceptions which work on the global scale, you engage literally every single person. You get people who have nothing to do with the actual incident, with the actual cause, to actually care about outcomes. You get people sitting in the US, the UK, in the Netherlands, talk about the Israel-Hamas conflict. They don't have any stake in that. At least the common man doesn't believe that they have any stake in that, but they still care about it. And that's because, and that is achieved through narratives. You can do this through demonstrations on university campuses, and you can do this through actual educational devices. This, and I invite my Bharatiya lawyers to take a look at this. This is a set of notes on a chapter called Conditions Favoring the Caste System. So this is what our students in Bharat are being taught about. Narratives are therefore carefully constructed also through academic articles. Here are two journal papers that I found when I literally just typed in casteism on Google Scholar. And there's one very, very important thing to notice over here. If you look at the second paper, sorry, it's going to be in this one, yeah. So same thing for feminism, for patriarchy. If you look at the last paper over here, it's called Towards a Theory of Brahmanic Patriarchy. This was written in 2000. Nobody had heard the word Brahmanical patriarchy in 2000. Everybody knows what it is today. Every one of you has heard this term. This narrative was initiated in the 2000s, in the late 1900s, and it has become common parlance today. This is the power of narratives. This is not the extent of the power of narratives. This is one example. To understand the extent, let's look at some outcomes. If Hindus are associated with terrible things like casteism and patriarchy, then it deteriorates their image. It deteriorates the way that people feel when you say Hindu. It attaches a negative connotation. And when you don't feel very good about when you don't feel very good about a community, you're more tolerant to atrocities on them. You're more tolerant to the fact that Ramdas Tiwari is murdered on the streets of Uttar Pradesh because he was a blasphemer. You don't get massive outrage for that. It also lends legitimacy to policy, to attacks in the framework of policy. Bill 403, how many of us are familiar with Bill 403? Can I get a... Okay, so most of us aren't. Bill 403 was a bill that was introduced to the California Senate, which essentially was anti-casteist. And this bill was introduced despite there being anti-discriminatory laws. The purpose of introducing this bill was to put it in the literal law that casteism is a problem within Hinduism. That is why the bill was introduced. Casteism is already protected within their anti-discriminatory laws, but that's why it was brought in. It leads to legitimacy of the Californian textbooks, which talked about narratives lead to the legitimacy of Californian textbooks of 2000, which portrayed the Hindu Dharma in a very misinformed and malice-filled light. It also changes how we perceive ourselves. So many of us know our own people from our own family, from our own friend circles, people on social media, who say that Rakhi is a misogynistic tradition. Karwa Chauth is a misogynistic tradition. The Sabriwala Mandir is a beacon of misogyny. This is what narratives do. Let's look at another example. Let's look at the narrative that Muslims are victims of abuse and persecution across the globe. Let's look at how this thing has been perpetrated through media. And these examples that I'm going to give you of news articles, they're all within the last 2 weeks. You see, 6 days ago, I made my presentation yesterday. These are, so you can subtract 1 day. This is when these articles were published. These are all written in the last 15 days. Okay? If you go on Google News and you search Islamophobia, you'll get maybe 50 results on Islamophobia that were published within the last 30 days, or last 3 weeks actually. When you Google Islamophobia on Google Scholar to see how many academicians have talked about it, how well discussed is it in the academic community, on college campuses, you see you have 105,000 results. To put this number into context, 377 for Hinduphobia. Again, what are the outcomes of this? Atrocities perpetrated by Islamists are not condemned as harshly as they should be, because if you're a victim, then you're lashing out. But if you're not a victim, then you are an oppressor. So frame the Muslims as victims. That's the narrative. There is a sympathetic attitude towards Muslims in universities and workplaces. So if you write on your college essay that, oh, I am a Muslim, I have struggled in the United States, your application will be looked at more favorably. It will literally advance the members of your community in societal, in professional, in economic aspects. That is the power of narratives. Overtly discriminatory and derogatory policies like hijab, like blasphemy laws in Islamic countries, like the practice of halala, all of these are not talked about with the fervor that they should be. This is the power of narratives. Okay, so let's get a raise of hands. How many people over here agree that narratives are super powerful and they can affect massive global large-scale change? Thank you. How do we construct them? What are the elements of a successful narrative? What makes a narrative successful? Here is one, and a very important one at that. Terminologies. What we call in Hindi, jumle. Terminologies are short one-word statements or one-word jumle, which condense a very big message into one single power-packed punch. And this is especially important in the age of electronic media when we have short attention spans. Long speeches and essays are not powerful anymore. What you want are terminologies which condense a very, very serious, emotionally appealing, emotionally charged message into one single word. Here are some examples and their key features. Liberal, equality, inclusion, choice and freedom, democracies. These are all terminologies, and the narratives around them have been able to successfully associate these with positive feelings. When you call someone liberal, it is a compliment. Therefore, when a party attaches itself to being liberal, despite the fact that they may be the most illiberal party in the history of humanity, it lends them some legitimacy. This is the power of narratives. In the red ones, you see words that are, or terminologies that have negative connotations. Look at Hindutva over there. Look at Hindutva over there. Back when we talked about Hinduphobia, the 377 results, maybe 150 out of them were about how Hinduphobia is actually a vehicle of Hindutva propaganda. That is how Hindutva is talked about in professional circles. What are the key features of terminologies? and this is perhaps the most important part of this talk, they appeal to the heart. They're all connected to a sense of justice. They're pro-oppressed. They innately relate to specific notions of good and evil. Logic is less important, and very importantly, abuse is okay. Sabko gali do. That is how terminologies achieve societal change, by abuse. Our strong terminologies, so say in this room, if we brainstorm for the next 10-15 minutes, we can maybe come up with a very good terminology. Will that be enough to own the narrative? I argue it won't. Here is why. The quality of terminologies does not ensure their message permeates into society. What you need for that are deliberate mechanisms that promote your terminologies, that promote your narratives, and they stifle adverse narratives and terminologies. Dipali ji gave very, very good practical examples of workplace conditions in which you can achieve this. And these mechanisms that we're talking about, which promote and stifle, they're the most effective in two spaces. Number one is education. And I believe this has two components. Number one is coursework. What are you methodically taught about a given issue? In a 9th grade textbook of history and civics in Bharat, if you're taught that Hinduism is inherently casteism and patriarchy, that will create a negative perception that will further this narrative. What are you taught methodically about a given issue? And the second, which relates to education, are student communities. What is your perception among the general public? The second vertical of how narratives are constructed is media. I will not talk about this. We have an entire session on media, which will talk about narratives and how they're built through media. So again, I implore you to attend that session and engage in that session as well. So before we move to the conclusions of this talk and of this session, let's do a brief recap of what we have learned. Narratives are about storytelling. They do not need to conform to truth. Narratives can therefore cause massive societal change, massive change at the societal level. Narratives are perhaps the single most important determiner of the power that a society holds. If you own the narrative, you own everything. Narratives are said through vehicles like visuals, like demonstrations, posters, coursework, which carry these power-packed terminologies. Because if you listen to a 1-hour lecture, what remains with you is not the entire 1-hour lecture. You're going to retain maybe a couple of excerpts. Terminologies are the heart of those excerpts. So for a successful narrative, strong terminologies, effective terminologies are key. Narrative pushing mechanisms in media and education are essential. I should have written essential in determining their efficacy. So what are our conclusions? This is the recap of what we have up until here. The recipe for owning narratives: come up with strong terminologies, come up with powerful terminologies, and construct mechanisms to promote these. In the context of education, student organizations like the NHSF that Nikitaji talked about, student organizations define the Hindu identity on campus, and they defend Hindus on campus from attacks. They show what the dharma is, what the Hindu dharma is to Hindus and outsiders, and they effectively respond to attacks on this Hindu identity by adversaries. And the second point is that there is an acute need for Hindu-minded Hindus, and I use this term very deliberately, for Hindu-minded Hindus to occupy strategically important roles in society. We need people in every single impactful field. Again, going back to what Dipali ji talked about. We need people in every single impactful field to push our agenda forward. Policy, law, economy, governance, NGO work, everything. We need people everywhere. How are we going to achieve this? Well, that will be the content of the workshop at the end of the conference. It will be the content of the education workshop. And with this, I'm done with my talk. Dhanyavad, Jai Shri Ram.